Hi everyone, this is lecture 14 in POS 273 International Relations, an online undergraduate course taught at the University of Maine. I'm your instructor, Rob Glover. So today's lecture looks at poverty and economic development. We're going to cover three specific questions. One, how can we define development? There's been quite a bit of debate over the past 50 or 60 years about what exactly constitutes economic development, and we'll delve into those debates a little bit. We'll also ask how the global efforts to promote development have evolved over time. There's been a pretty significant evolution in terms of how the global community approaches the question of development, and we'll look a little bit at that. And we'll also ask, how do policy decisions impact people's access to basic resources? So to start, it's always important to remind ourselves of the stakes of economic development and strategies to address economic development. So there's a short clip here that just kind of lays out some of the development challenges that we face in the world today. It's pretty significant, the scale of global poverty and the gap between wealthy nations like the United States or France or Japan and some of the developing nations and the types of challenges that they face, which are very different. So this just kind of briefly goes through some of those issues to give you a sense of why is this an important issue.
This is Innocent, a newborn baby in Zambia, one of the poorest countries in Africa. What are his opportunities in a world where the gap between rich and poor is still growing? Where the wealthiest 1% possess about 40% of the global wealth, and the 3 richest billionaires own more than the 58 poorest countries combined. In a world where 600 million children live in extreme poverty, and where 19,000 children die of poverty every day, that is 1 child every 4.5 seconds. Where food prices are on the rise again, where nearly 1.5 billion people have to get by on $1.25 per day, the poverty line. That means half a loaf of bread in Europe or the US. Another 3 billion people live on $2 a day, which means a kilo of potatoes in developed countries, where 300,000 women die during childbirth because of medical complications which can be easily treated in the developed world, and where the babies of these deceased mothers have up to 10 times the risk of not reaching their 2nd birthday. Where the life expectancy in Zambia is 52 years, compared with 81 years in the Netherlands. Where globally 80% of children go to school, but in Western and Central Africa 40% do not. In the whole of Africa, over 45 million children do not go to school, which means that they will lack the education to be able to work their way out of poverty. During this film, another 25 children have died of hunger-related diseases. Is there no hope at all? There is, because according to the World Bank, in the last 2 decades, real progress has been made. We will reach the most important Millennium goal by 2015, the halving of extreme poverty compared to 1990. It is possible. Tackling poverty is not a hopeless battle. Also, in times of economic crisis, we must try harder, because only then will there be a future for millions of deprived children, and for Innocent.
Okay, so like I said, I show that to you guys just to give you a sense of how severe some of the challenges associated with global poverty are. There are statistics there that should be striking. Hopefully, sometimes when you're presented with lots of statistics, they just kind of wash over you. But the idea that a child is dying every 4.5 seconds from hunger-related causes or preventable disease, the fact that 3 billion people in the world, a significant chunk of the global population, is living under $2 a day, and these really striking figures about lack of access to education, which is something that in developed countries we kind of take for granted, the fact that we have access to education and that everybody will get at least some sort of basic education, but not the case for a pretty healthy percentage of the world's population. So these are issues that we've always faced globally and within societies, is just kind of lack of access to basic resources, people dying because of poverty. They're dying because they lack the access to resources that would enable them to address pretty preventable and fundamental aspects of basic human health, or hunger, or all of these things that we have the ability to deal with. It's not that we lack the ability; it's that these individuals lack the resources to take advantage of that. So development and poverty are huge issues, and they've really galvanized the international community in the last 20 or 30 years, particularly in the aftermath of the Cold War. There was a lot of focus on, okay, what is the new agenda for the international community? How do we address some of these issues that have been particularly problematic for so long? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the international community, how they define development, and some of the strategies that they've employed to foster economic development and deal with global poverty since World War II. You remember when we were talking about IPE, we talked about World War II as kind of this watershed moment for the creation of international organizations and different strategies of dealing with organization and coordination issues in the global economy. And that also applies to development and poverty alleviation. So we talked about the Bretton Woods Conference. And when we were talking about global trade and finance, we talked about two organizations that grew out of the Bretton Woods Conference, the IMF and the what was the Global Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, what ended up becoming the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And there was another very important organization, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the IBRD, which evolved into the World Bank. And so that is more of kind of the development-centered organization that was created at the Bretton Woods. As World War II was winding down, they recognized that economic development and addressing poverty were going to be key concerns of the post-war international community. And they created this International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, first and foremost to rebuild Europe, because as we said, Europe was destroyed, right? Most of its major urban areas, most of its industrial areas had been destroyed. And so rebuilding Europe was a central goal. But that happened relatively quickly. And then you had this organization that was set up with a fundamental goal, and that goal was achieved. And so then they shifted to that focus on development and poverty. And the IBRD evolved into the World Bank, or what's sometimes called the World Bank Group. The International Bank for Reconstruction and Development still exists. It's part of that larger organization called the World Bank. But its focus is very, very much on development and poverty alleviation. The efforts that they undertook in the aftermath of World War II rest upon a specific understanding of development and what causes development. How does a country become economically developed? And so it makes sense to talk about those a little bit. Oops, we just watched that. So defining development. For the most part, the international community in the aftermath of World War II was relying upon something called modernization theory and developed a model of thinking about development that is sometimes called the orthodox model. That's the way that your book refers to it. So this was the dominant mode of thinking for national governments. It was the dominant mode of thinking for these very important international organizations after World War II. And basically, modernization theory and the orthodox model see development as synonymous with economic growth happening within the context of a free market economy, a capitalist economy in which the state is playing a relatively minimalist role in the economy. It's not like a communist society where the state is producing things, the state owns lots of resources, the state is telling different economic actors how much they're going to produce, and they're setting prices. Free market economy means that producers and consumers are making a lot of those decisions on their own, and that interplay between supply and demand is what determines prices. It's what determines the availability of goods, right? So this is, I imagine for most of you, this is the type of economy which you've grown up experiencing. You've probably grown up in the context of a capitalist economy. That's what they felt was really the engine of growth. And development, being a developed country, meant that economically you were growing, right? So how are they going to measure development? They measure development with GDP, gross domestic product, which is just a kind of aggregate of all your production of goods and services, dollar amount of that figure, how much is your production of goods and services and wealth creation, um, you know, what does it constitute in the aggregate, and then also GDP growth rate. So basically a measure of to what extent is your economy, your economic output growing, right? So development means economic growth from this point of view. And they have a certain way of thinking about the causes of economic growth. So countries that are underdeveloped, their biggest problem is lack of adequate wealth, right? So they're not producing enough and there's not enough money circulating in the economy. And so those countries have to spur economic growth. And they will do so following pretty much the same path as the economic powers in what's sometimes called the global north. There's a distinction between the global north and the global south. Global north refers to basically just wealthy, um, advanced economies like we'd see in Western Europe, North America, etc. Global South would refer to developing countries, countries that are still experiencing problems in terms of their citizens having access to basic resources, and there's not a lot of wealth flowing through those economies. So if the Global South wants to become developed, they're going to have to follow basically the same incremental steps taken by the countries that have already become developed. Right? And the idea is economies reach what's called a takeoff point in which industry is thriving, wealth is being created, and then eventually, even if there's individuals who aren't experiencing that growth, the benefits are going to trickle down to the population as a whole. So if lots of economic activity is happening in your country, it's just kind of logical from this framework that everyone will begin to benefit. There will be more jobs, there'll be more investment, there'll be investment from abroad. You'll start to see more foreign direct investment as an economy starts to grow. And eventually, everyone's boat will float higher. Okay. Now, we can look at a model of this. This actually, the idea of modernization theory comes from an American economic historian named W.W. Rostow, who said that there are 5 stages of economic development. You pass through these incremental stages. You start at the level of a traditional society. That's where everyone at some point or another started, in which there's not a lot of industry. There's not a lot of commerce. Basically, you're engaged in subsistence in order to provide for your needs. And there might not even be kind of an advanced market in place. You might be getting the things that you need through bartering for those goods. Okay. And then you move to transitional stages. You start to see specialization, meaning that instead of individuals trying to produce all of the things that they need for subsistence purposes, they're specializing in certain things. So specialized agriculture, specialized production. You move to the stage of takeoff, which if you want to think of takeoff in concrete terms, think of the Industrial Revolution, the age in which we had mechanized production, large factories, requires greater investment. We start to see regional growth, right? So the benefits of growth in one area are spreading outwards. And this produces political change, right? As people move into a more organized economy, their political system follows suit. You start to have the growth of organized parties, labor movements, etc. And then stage 4 is kind of further along that path, greater innovation, less reliance upon imports, more investment. And the final stage, the stage that, according to Rostow, everybody should be trying to move towards, is the final stage of high mass consumption, which, looking around the United States in the 1960s, would have been what Rostow saw. Consumer-oriented goods, a vast array of choices in the market, right? And the service sector becomes more important than even the industrial sector. Sometimes you hear the United States referred to as a post-industrial economy, and to a large part that's true. A lot of the industrial processes, manufacture, the kind of factory model, a lot of that work has been shipped abroad to countries that are not quite as advanced a state of development as we are. and you think of most of the jobs that maybe your parents have, or the jobs that you'll be seeking when you graduate from university, and these would be things like education, healthcare, finance, marketing. Those are all service sector jobs, right? So that's where you're ending up in terms of the final stage of mass consumption. For Rostow, this was a universal model. This was, every country goes through these various stages and eventually hopefully achieves that state of high mass consumption if they follow through all these steps. Rostow viewed it as impossible to skip a step. You could never go straight from a traditional society to, high mass consumption. There would have to be these incremental stages in between. And this vision of what development is leads to a certain set of policy prescriptions, right? This is what you should do depending on where you are in this gradual, incremental process of development, right? So if you're at stage 2, then you need to think about what are the things that you as a country need to do in order to make it to stage 3, okay? So that's driving a lot of the thinking in terms of just what development is at this point. The 1950s, the 1960s, right up until really the 1990s, this was the dominant thinking. And it's also driving a set of policy prescriptions. So the major organizations, the major policymakers that are advising countries about how to pursue economic development are also engaged in policy recommendations. They're making policy prescriptions for how countries should achieve development based on this thinking. And the major one, the one that kind of dominates most of these organizations and most of the policies sought by Washington and the United States and other Western powers during this period, is called the Washington Consensus. It's basically a set of policies for countries that are attempting to achieve economic development, what they should do in order to try to develop. There's about 10 components of the Washington Consensus. I won't go through all of them, but it's a very kind of capitalist-oriented, market-oriented strategy of achieving economic growth. And again, going back to how they define development, economic growth and development are viewed as synonymous. So if you're achieving economic growth, then your country is developing. And these are the policies that will get you to that point. They will get you to the point in which you are growing economically and you're achieving development. So what are some of the policies? Those who favor the Washington Consensus are going to want to see trade liberalization, right? So they're going to want to see the economy opened up to trade and foreign direct investment. So if your economy is closed, your economy is shut down, producers from around the world don't have access to your markets, then that is not liberalization. That's the opposite of that. What you need to do is open up your economy so that producers from anywhere can bring their goods into your markets and attempt to sell them. You also have to be open to foreign direct investment. So if a country wants to come in and invest money and build some sort of physical plant within your country, you need to figure out ways to entice them in to do so, and certainly not create obstacles, not create lots of red tape or procedures or restrictions that might cause that foreign investor not to view your country favorably. Fiscal discipline is a big one. We talked about this a little bit in the context of the IMF and some of their conditionality when they give a loan to a country that's in a state of crisis. But this also applies to countries that are trying to develop. A big part of the Washington Consensus is that state spending needs to be reduced. The state can't be too large of an actor in the economy. There needs to be what's called fiscal discipline. So if the state is spending a lot of things, there's entitlement programs or very generous supports for healthcare or education, social spending, the Washington Consensus is going to say, okay, what can you do to reduce and draw down state spending? Number 3 is privatization. In lots of these economies, there might be state-owned industries. You might have, for instance, like utility companies, electricity and water might be state-owned enterprises. And the Washington Consensus is going to favor putting those things in private hands. Take those state-owned industries, put them into private hands. They view that as a strategy to make them operate more efficiently. They view that as a strategy also ties back to fiscal discipline. If you don't have state-owned industries, it means that the government isn't coming in periodically and providing an influx of cash to a struggling utility, right? The market sorts that out as opposed to the state providing that support. Deregulation, reducing regulation and oversight of firms that might impede market entry or hinder competition. So the various forms of regulation that a company or an individual firm might be subject to, you need to draw those down. If you're trying to draw investment into your economy, having lots of regulations and lots of kind of onerous requirements that that firms have to abide by within your state is not a good way to do it. So in lots of developing countries, you'll see significantly less regulation on things like labor, environmental standards than you would in the United States or the UK or France, right? And that's by design. That's policymakers saying, yes, if Zambia wants to develop, they need to draw down these regulations. If Vietnam wants to bring in foreign direct investment, you need to draw down these regulations that might be driving away foreign firms. And then lastly, tax reform. Again, some of this relates back to what we saw with the IMF and how they deal with crises within countries. But you need to broaden the tax base to enhance the revenue base for the state, right? So that means collecting more taxes, but broadening the tax base in such a way that you're not just collecting taxes from the foreign investors or companies, but also from your citizens, and enhancing your enforcement of tax collection so that there's not people evading taxes, everybody's paying their fair share. That's often, it's something that we take for granted in the United States, that if you don't pay your taxes, they'll come and get you. But in developing countries with limited resources, that can be much more challenging to actually have and enforce a tax code in a way that provides the state the revenue that it needs to function. So what are the results of this? The Washington Consensus is applied pretty consistently in lots of different areas over decades, over 30, 40 years in some cases. And the results are fairly mixed. Many of the countries that put these policies into place did so pretty diligently and didn't do so well economically. We didn't see an explosion of economic growth. We didn't see what Rostow was predicting with that, stages across a timeline of countries experiencing economic growth. There was a report from the UN Development Program in the 1990s that was kind of evaluating the effectiveness of the Washington Consensus and said the following. No fewer than 100 countries, all developing or in transition, have experienced serious economic decline over the past 3 decades. As a result, per capita income in these 100 countries is lower than it was 10, 20, even 30 years ago. So in some cases, those are countries that didn't rigorously apply the Washington Consensus, but in many cases, they did, and it didn't produce the results that they had hoped. Also, if we look at the countries that did develop over this time period, the 1960s, the 1970s, the 1980s, many of the countries did not closely follow the Washington Consensus model. East Asia is a region that has grown enormously to the point where, in the 1950s, the Koreans were struggling to feed their population, so were the Indians. And now those are some of the largest economies in the world. They experience explosive growth. China is another example, explosive growth over the same time period. But if you look at the economic strategies applied in those countries, it wasn't the Washington Consensus. There were elements of that, right? There were parts of it, but they had a pretty eclectic mix of different strategies to try to achieve development. So by the 1990s, people were starting to say this rigorously applying this one-size-fits-all method as a strategy of, addressing poverty and creating economic development seems insufficient. It doesn't seem like it's going to produce the results that a country might want. So this led to some alternate thinking on development. um, alternate approaches, really, I guess starting in the 1970s, but coming into their own in the 1990s, as we could look at several decades of the Washington Consensus and several decades of this kind of orthodox view of development as economic growth. And a host of critics, both from civil society, from NGOs and organizations, celebrities like Bono was a big advocate. Pope John Paul II was a big advocate for taking a more um, uh, nuanced approach to development, but also from international organizations, from folks within the World Bank or folks within the UN Development Program saying we need a new approach. We need a different way of thinking about development. So the argument was that development shouldn't focus solely on economics and shouldn't just be focused on, is an economy growing, but should focus more broadly on human development. So what does that mean? Um, in in general, right, we're going to shift away from this focus on GDP growth and start to look at individuals and how they're gaining access to the basic needs and the primary resources that they need to live a dignified life. Right? So the human development approach says focus on material and non-material basic needs. What is a non-material basic need? Things like dignity, things like freedom, things like happiness. There's a whole realm of economics now that says instead of measuring economic growth, the purpose of economics should be to measure human happiness, right? Those are the kinds of approaches that all of a sudden we're talking about. We can't assume that economic growth is synonymous with happiness or dignity. In fact, it might not be. You look at some of the countries that are growing most rapidly, and people aren't exactly happy. They aren't exactly fulfilled. They don't view themselves as living dignified lives, right? So focus on material, non-material basic needs. Development strategies should not be imposed from above. They should come from within societies. The Washington Consensus in virtually every setting was not an outgrowth of people within a developing country getting together and saying, okay, how are we going to address poverty? How are we going to get our economy to develop? It was outsiders, experts from various organizations or national governments coming in and saying, this is what you need to do. Here are the steps you need to take. Human development also focuses on the environment. So some strategies that produce economic growth, many strategies that produce economic growth, are not going to be sustainable environmentally. China has grown enormously in the past 30 years or so, but they have done so by inflicting tremendous, devastating harm to their environment, to their waterways, to their air. And so maybe we should try to think of strategies for development that don't completely lay waste to the environment. And it also views development as about structural transformation. So development isn't just about more money in an economy. It is about the structure of the economy changing. And by extension, when you have economic transformation, you have transformations in society, transformations in gender relations, transformations in power relations, and all of this is political, right? That translates to changes politically as a result of this structural transformation. So this is a more holistic approach. It's an approach that's somewhat more difficult to measure and to talk about concretely. The UN Development Program in the 1990s developed an alternative way of measuring development called the Human Development Index, right? The Human Development Index, or the HDI, is basically it emerged out of those working within international organizations seeing the flaws in measuring development in terms of GDP growth and GDP itself. So these purely economic measures don't give us a very good picture of true human development. And so we need a new way to measure it. And they created this index. An index is anytime you create kind of a composite measure from a variety of different sources. So the index that you might be most familiar with is your GPA. Your GPA is an index. They take your grades, your performance throughout your college career, and they have a mechanism for computing a single score on a single scale to assess your overall performance. But that measure, that single number, that all-important number that you're all striving to increase, right, is a function of many different things, right? So it's an index, it's a composite of a lot of different individual scores, and it's measuring a lot of individual things. And the Human Development Index does the same thing. It's 4 indicators across 3 dimensions. The 3 dimensions are health, education, and living standards. The 4 indicators are life expectancy at birth. Then the 2 on education are years of schooling, average years of schooling, and expected years of schooling. And then on living standards, they take your gross national income per capita. So the total income of a country divided by its population to create this index, right? The index is, it operates 0 to 1, right? Higher is better. You want to be, as close to 1 as possible, as far away from 0 as possible. And this gives you, just kind of charts out on a map, the overall global performance on the Human Development Index. It aligns pretty closely with factors like GDP per capita, right? The overall wealth of a country is going to be pretty closely aligned with its performance on certain human development measures, right? But not perfectly, and we'll talk about that in a little second. What you do see here is that Western Europe, Japan, most of East Asia, Australia, and North America are the highest. They're basically at 0.85 or above. Central Africa is the lowest in terms of human development. You see it, it's the only countries here that are in the red. And you see kind of a mixed record in Central America, South America, North Africa, Central Asia, right? So it aligns pretty closely with, if you're an observer of different countries around the world, it aligns pretty closely with what you might expect. But there are ways in which this differs from GDP per capita, and where you really see that is individual country scores when you compare GDP per capita versus the Human Development Index. So on your left here, you have the top 10 economies as measured by GDP per capita. On your right, you have the top 10 economies as measured by this Human Development Index. And there's pretty significant variation. You see that Luxembourg is this tiny little nation in Europe, ranks very, very highly in terms of the economy, but completely drops out of the top 10 when we consider Human Development Index, right? When we start to take into account this broader measure of human development. Australia drops a few, right? It goes from it goes up a few. It goes from number 5 in terms of GDP per capita, but it's number 2 in terms of the HDI. The United States does not show up in the top 10 in terms of economies and GDP per capita, but it ranks number 4. Qatar is really interesting. That's number 2, and it drops completely off the map in terms of HDI. I think it's not pictured on this map, but I want to say it falls to roughly the middle of the pack in terms of the Human Development Index. I think it's right about where some of the countries in South America would be, countries like Paraguay, right? And think about why that might be. You have a few other countries that rank very, very highly on GDP per capita, but drop off completely when it comes to Human Development Index. So the countries on the left that are ranking highly have lots of income, lots of wealth. GDP per capita doesn't tell us anything about, 1, how that income is distributed, and 2, how it's utilized, right? So if a country has a very high GDP per capita, but they have enormous economic inequality, they have, a few hundred billionaires, and then the vast majority of people have very, very low wages, that's not going to reflect well on the Human Development Index side, right? Also, how are they using their resources? One of the big concerns in countries like Qatar or the United Arab Emirates is that they're using their resources in unsustainable, irresponsible ways, right? There was this massive influx of wealth into those countries as a result of the oil boom, right, and how dependent we are on the Middle East for fossil fuels. And then they just started building these ostentatious, very, very showy cities in the middle of the desert that lack basic infrastructure. One of the big issues in the United Arab Emirates is dealing with waste. You have all these people living in cities, and you don't really have the infrastructure to deal with human waste. So they have these caravans of trucks that export it out of the city and find some place to dump it. They're also just kind of building these consumer palaces, these malls in which you can buy all sorts of consumer goods that seem ridiculous. I believe the United Arab Emirates has an indoor ski slope, right? An indoor ski slope might not be the best use of resources, particularly if you have an unequal distribution of wealth and there's lots of people in your society that don't have access to the basic resources they need in order for your country to perform well in the Human Development Index. So how you use your resources matters, and who has resources, how broadly they're distributed is going to matter. And that's the biggest thing that you start to see when you compare GDP per capita and the Human Development Index side by side, is that some countries have enormous wealth, but it might be unevenly distributed, and how they're using it might not be viewed as sustainable and beneficial to the largest number of their citizens as a whole. Okay. So, what does human development mean when we translate it into its own set of policy prescriptions? The best way to think about this is the Millennium Development Goals. So here you see the 8 overarching Millennium Development Goals. These were crafted at the UN Development Program. We have eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, achieving universal primary education, gender equality, child mortality, maternal health, combating preventable diseases, ensuring environmental sustainability, and then a global partnership for development. Those are the 8 overarching goals. And what are the Millennium Development Goals? Basically, in 2000, we established a set of guidelines that the global community was going to strive to reach by 2015. All of the UN member countries, so virtually every country in the world, there's a few holdouts, but pretty much every country in the world, and 23 major international organizations, including all of the organizations that we've talked about. The UN Development Program, the World Bank, the IMF, the WTO, all of those different organizations signed on to these goals. Now, with that said, the goals are, there are no hard enforcements. If countries, do not meet the Millennium Development Goals, or the international community as a whole does not meet the Millennium Development Goals, there are no punishments. They do not lose any sort of, rights or benefits within the international community. So this is purely a set of guidelines. It is not, international law that would in some way be enforced. So that's it. It's just a set of objectives. But they're extraordinarily ambitious. So in 2000, we were saying in 15 years, by this year, 2015, that we were going to provide universal primary education for all children, cut global hunger in half, cut the proportion of people in poverty in half, cut those without access to safe water in half. And in 2000, we were also very concerned about HIV/AIDS because at that point, the HIV infection rate was still growing. It's kind of leveled off at this point, at least globally. But we wanted to halt and begin to reverse the spread of HIV/AIDS globally, right? So that's just a subset, right? There are those 8 overarching goals, and then you have a subset of every one of those goals would have very specific, measurable goals attached to it, these goals that we see here. Cutting global hunger in half is what we mean specifically once we dig into the nitty-gritty. And at the time, they estimated that this would require an extra $40 to $60 billion annually, so every year, in global development aid. So it was also, in addition to being a set of guidelines, it was a call to the international community and to the major wealthy countries in the international community to provide more in terms of global developmental aid. They actually set the figure of, I believe it was 0.7% of gross domestic product should be allocated to foreign aid with a focus on development, right? Which is a figure that only a handful of countries in the world actually meet, even though, less than 1% doesn't sound like very much. It's not a figure that most countries meet. I think the United States, usually it's somewhere between 0.1 and 0.2%. So 0.1% to 0.2% is what we typically provide in foreign aid of our gross domestic product. So it was a call to action and a call for more resources. So how did we do with regard to those goals? Well, it's kind of mixed. There were some areas in which we performed remarkably well, at least measured in the aggregate. There are other areas in which we're certainly still struggling. So I'm going to show you a short clip that talks about our progress on the UN Development Goals and what might be next, which is the big question. Obviously, we're in 2015, so this is the point at which we assess our progress on the Millennium Development Goals, and then we think about how we might pivot to some new strategy or new set of goals. And that's a conversation that's very much ongoing in the international community right now. So I'll show you this clip and then come back and talk about what that next step might be.
If you wanted to make the world a better place, what goals would you set? The elimination of hunger, education for all, or perhaps the end of poverty? What would you choose? In 2015, the UN is doing just that, setting goals to make the world better over the next 15 years. They've done this before. In the year 2000, the Millennium Development Goals were set, covering 8 important areas. Overall, they were a great success. We've halved the proportion of people living in extreme poverty. 9 out of 10 children are now enrolled in primary school, and we've made great progress against disease. The world is a better place because we set goals and worked hard to reach them. 15 years on, it's time to set them once more. However, right now the UN is being inundated with hundreds and hundreds of suggestions from interest groups all around the world. In fact, the list of suggestions is stretched out to more than 1,000 targets. Let's be realistic. 1,000 priorities is as good as 0 priorities. And we're going to spend perhaps $700 billion over the next 15 years in these goals. So it's important we get them right. We need to pick the best ones, the ones that generate the most benefit. We can't do everything, and we can't waste our effort working towards goals that are not smart. So which ones should we choose? At the Copenhagen Consensus Center, we're working on delivering information that will make our choice simpler and smarter. We're putting together some of the best and brightest to look at this problem. We want to put a price tag on each proposal. This matters because the next set of UN goals is like a supermarket. Lots of choice, lots of appealing goals. But imagine if you didn't know how much each choice would cost, or how much good it would do. One idea would be to reduce malaria by 50%. Another could be to eliminate it. Eliminate sounds better, but if it costs much, much more and we have to give up on something else, is it really the best choice out there? And what about reducing malaria versus reducing hunger versus avoiding pollution versus better education? In a perfect world, we should do all of these, but even large budgets run out, and we need to know which ones to pick off the shelf first. We want to be clear on the benefits that each proposal brings, so we end up with the goals we know we can afford and goals we know will make the world a better place. So if you want to help, what can you do? Make sure policymakers have the best information. Give us your help. Join the conversation and jump on to post2015consensus.com for more information.
Okay, so this is an organization that's trying to shape that next conversation about what the next set of priorities on international economic development ought to be, recognizing that that's that's the next kind of conversation that the UN will be having. They talked a little bit about how we've done on achieving the Millennium Development Goals. Obviously, it's a very ambitious set of goals, and they present it very positively, right? They present the successes. There's a significantly broader conversation that there's a lot of development advocates and critics saying that the Millennium Development Goals weren't as successful as some proponents have purported that they have been. And that's kind of an ongoing conversation, is just how successful were we? We certainly weren't successful in terms of attracting the level of developmental aid that we had sought. Remember, they had said this would require an additional $40 to $60 billion a year in developmental aid. That number was never achieved, but there are some tremendous successes, particularly with the global poverty rate and some of our performance on preventable diseases like malaria and access to education, which they mentioned in the video. So there are some areas in which we achieved pretty remarkable success in the last 15 years. And so now the big question is, what's next? At the point at which this video was made, that was still an open conversation. The UN has been furiously discussing this for about the past year. What are the goals that are going to replace the Millennium Development Goals? And this is going to be the global agenda on development for the next 15 years. So from 2015 to 2030, this new set of goals will be what we focus on. And what has emerged really is something called the Sustainable Development Goals, or the SDGs. This is largely focused on the connection, the interplay between development and the environment. One of the things that we're seeing now with development is that as societies grow and they develop, they may be making enormous gains in certain respects, but those gains can be canceled out. So if they're making gains in terms of like human health, right, or combating childhood mortality, at the same time, if they're increasing their reliance upon fossil fuels, they might be canceling out those broader gains in human health through some of the costs, some of the impacts that the consumption of fossil fuels might have. So basically what the next set of goals is going to be zeroing in on is, how do we develop in such a way that the gains that we make in one area are not canceled out by advances that we make in another area, really kind of linking the environmental impact and the human impact of increased development. I'm not going to go into these in any detail because they are not finalized and they may change. They are actually being debated and being finalized as we take this class in August 2015. If you're interested in what they look like and how much they carry over from or diverge from the previous Millennium Development Goals, you can go to this link, sustainabledevelopment.un.org, and look at them in all their glory, at least in their tentative form. And I would say within probably the next 3 to 5 months, you'll see a final form of these Sustainable Development Goals that has the support of the UN and eventually the support of member countries and international organizations. So that's kind of where we are in terms of development. There's been an enormous shift in thinking about what is development and how to achieve development, and we have seen some movement on the international level, particularly with the UN Development Program as kind of a leader in shifting away from this orthodox view of economic development being synonymous with development as a whole to something broader and something based on a broader set of expectations and requirements, this human development agenda. It's actually a perfect segue into our lecture for next time, which focuses on the global environment and some of the ways in which we try to coordinate our efforts at the international level to ensure that we protect the global environment and we use resources in a way that is sustainable and has the least possible impact on human health and health of children, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very fitting that we talk about development and the environment one after another, because that increasingly is the way that the international community is thinking about these issues. I want you to read the chapter in your Lamming textbook on the global environment. And as you do so, think about how globalization, which we've been talking about for the entire course, and environmental change are connected, and probably both positively and negatively. There's certainly some negative connections between globalization and environmental change, but there's also some positive changes. I also want you to think about climate change. That's going to be something that we talk about quite a bit in this lecture, this upcoming lecture. And how climate change might begin to impact other areas of international relations, or maybe it already is, right? So if the predictions about the climate change that we're going to experience in the next several decades are accurate, what are the security outcomes that we might see as a result? What are the economic outcomes that we might see as a result? What are the development outcomes, et cetera, et cetera? Whatever issue you want to focus on in international relations, just think about how climate change might impact that and what the repercussions of this frightening prospect of rapid climate change might be for other areas. So we'll pick up there next time. Thanks very much.